And thank you all for joining us today for virtual webinar to discuss emergent threats to hunting and wildlife from misguided opposition to sustainable forest management on public land. My name is Mark Lance, and I'm the Southeastern States Coordinator for the Congressional Sportsman's Foundation. This is the last of CSF's virtual policy forums we're hosting this summer, and today we have an outstanding group of panelists joining us. Our panelists today will discuss the trend of increased opposition to sustainable forest management on public lands, particularly in the eastern United States. While opposition to wildlife habitat work on national forests is not new, anti-forest management interests are expanding their work to stop wildlife habitat improvement projects on state-owned lands, for example, wildlife management areas and state forests. Our panelists today include John Colclasure with the Congressional Sportsman's Foundation, Senator Mike Bell with the Tennessee Legislative Sportsman's Caucus, Mike Butler and Kevin Botts with the Tennessee Wildlife Federation, Charles Ferris with the Rough Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society, and David Whitmire with the North Carolina Fish and Wildlife Conservation Council. Each panelist will speak for a little more than 5 minutes, and if you have questions, please note them to hold to the end of the Q&A session. You'll be able to submit questions in writing through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, I would like to note that the Congressional Sportsman's Foundation is recording today's presentation. However, any recording, rebroadcast, or retransmission of this presentation or any of its parts by the attendees without the express written consent of the Congressional Sportsman's Foundation is prohibited. Now, at this time, it's my privilege to introduce CSF's President and CEO, Jeff Crane. Jeff, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. The Congressional Sportsman's Foundation has really been pleased to have the kind of turnout and participation that we've enjoyed through this summer webinar series, and I think we're finishing with a particularly strong topic. And thank all of our panelists and for joining us to bring and share their points of view. The Sportsman's Foundation was founded to support the Congressional Sportsman's Caucus in the U.S. Congress and 50 state legislative sportsman's caucuses around the country, as well as the bipartisan Governor's Caucus. And I think sometimes the view is that our concerns are really just about hunting and fishing rules and regulations and policies, and that certainly is true. But I think we're short selling all of us as hunters and anglers, because conservation are what we really are. And without healthy habitats, without sustainable efforts to manage those habitats, we would not have the success that we have today in our uniquely American system of conservation funding, whereby the users of the resource, in our case hunters and anglers, actually put a large part of the bill. So we are vested in the success of wildlife and fisheries and their habitats. Clearly, the issue with timber and with large scale forests and whatnot play a really important role in this discussion, whether it's the western landscape and catastrophic fire, or more to the eastern side that we're talking about today, and successional forests and just rules and regulations that mandate things that are not smart uses of the resource. So there are a whole lot smarter people on the call today that are going to tell you a lot more about it. So I want to thank you again. John Colclasure is our resident expert here on our staff on all things forestry. And so I will turn the panel back over and look forward to a good discussion. Thanks again for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate you providing those open remarks. First, I'd like to thank James Cummins and Wildlife Mississippi for sponsoring this webinar. We couldn't do the work we do without their support. So thank you, James, sincerely for all your support. Before we turn over to our first panelist, Senator Mike Bell, I'd kind of like to set the stage for the conversation. Obviously, we're all here because we care about hunting and fishing, and our fish and wildlife resources and managing habitat is key to supporting robust populations. For this discussion, to provide quality hunting experiences. And so while most of the land in the South and the East is in private ownership, generally more than 90% in most states, eastern states do have extensive public land holdings, state and federal, that are important for wildlife conservation and hunting. particularly for people that depend on public land for their hunting access. That's where they have to hunt. They don't have access to private lands. And public lands is a buzzword these days, and issues around funding and access is on a lot of people's minds, and that's a great thing. But we also want to underscore a component of access is availability for land to hunt, and that also means land to hunt where you have something to hunt. And what we're seeing, particularly on U.S. Forest Service lands, is a sharp decline in game species because of a lack of habitat, because of a lack of management. So, just for context, think back to the timber wars of the 80s and to where we are today on federal lands. Timber harvest levels have declined significantly. So today, if you look at the George Washington Jefferson National Forest, we're at 1.1 million acres in Virginia, or the Nantahala of Pisgah, about 1 million acres in North Carolina. Each of them harvests about less than 800 acres per year. So what that results in is less than 1% early successional habitat. And so then that contributes to a decline in game species, a decline in hunter harvest rates for deer, for turkey, for grouse, for young forest species, and species that benefit from disturbance. And then also consequently, it results in declines in hunter participation rates, which is obviously what we're really concerned about. But the problem with managing federal lands is not new. The hunting community is well aware of this issue, and there's been a lot of work at the federal level and continue to work to do this, the legislation and regulatory side, to improve federal forest management. So whether that's our organization and others on this call supporting the Resilient Federal Forest Act, NEPA streamlining efforts, trying to expand authorities to the Farm Bill, categorical exclusions, stewardship contracting, good neighbor authority, and others. The takeaway is that we're doing all this work, but it's still an uphill battle to manage federal lands proactively for wildlife. Whereas conversely, on state lands, states are generally largely free from those similar constraints imposed on federal lands. So while states generally have pretty wide latitude to manage their lands, so they manage their WMAs or state forests, a lot of good habitat work is accomplished on state lands. And personally, when I think about where I want to hunt, I tend to go to WMAs or state forests over the national forests because they have better management and better hunting opportunities. And so kind of turn to the crux of the first part of this webinar, we want to bring attention to the growing trend towards opposing habitat work on state lands. And while the list of opposition to federal projects is just endless, whether it's on the Daniel Boone in Kentucky or Monongahela in West Virginia or Cherokee in East Tennessee, we're starting to see more scrutiny of management on state lands. So Senator Bell and the Tennessee Wildlife Federation are going to get into some issues on WMAs in Tennessee. But also last year, that kind of resulted in some legislation being filed. There were two bills in Tennessee last year that would have Senate Bill 2860 and House Bill 2769. They would have prevented the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency from harvesting more than 10 acres. Yes, 10 acres on a WMA over a 2-year period. So you can't get any habitat work done if you can't cut more than 2 acres. In North Carolina last year, we saw a bill that would have authorized cities and counties to enable them to adopt standards for the quote preservation of trees on public and private property, basically giving a county or a local government oversight on state lands. In Indiana, Nick Bouger's on this call, he could talk a lot about it. There's been attempts to transfer a state forest to a state park, to stop management on state forests. There's a bill to require mandatory set aside for 10% for old forests instead of management on the ground per project level analysis. Mississippi this year, there's a pushback on the Pascagoula River WMA for timber management. In North Carolina, the game lands there, in areas of growing population, people move next to game lands, think it's a state park, so then they're calling the agency, complain about management on those. And in Vermont, also very concerning, there's a petition this year for the state to adopt a set of process rules for the oversight of WMAs and state forests. Basically, essentially similar to NEPA, which guides a lot of the management or public process input on federal lands. That would have basically essentially gave an increased voice to people that are going to oppose management on those state lands. So thankfully that did not go through at this time. But while these efforts are an alarming trend, we want to highlight this as a community for everybody on this call to something that we need to stay on top of and work together to support our professional wildlife managers and their ability to put habitat on the ground, whether that's young forests, open woodlands, grasslands, or other habitats that are in short supply on federal lands. So with that introduction, thanks for your patience there with me. I'd like to turn over to our first speaker, Senator Mike Bell. Senator Bell is co-chair of the Tennessee Legislative Sportsman's Caucus. He's a member of the NASCA Executive Council, and he's a champion for hunters and anglers in the Tennessee General Assembly. Senator Bell, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your insight and from your experience as a legislator with the pushback to the quail habitat restoration project on the Bridgestone Firestone Wildlife Management Area.
All right. Thank you, John, and thank you for having me here today. And I want to start this out with a personal story. I think, John, you've probably heard before. I've got a small farm, and on this farm, we had about 80, this was back in probably 1999, 2000. We had about 80 acres of pine trees, big pine trees, beautiful to walk through. We hunted the area, deer hunted the area. Great. You could see under the canopy you could have a shot in there sometimes of 100 yards, which in woods that can be kind of long because of the lack of vegetation under it. And it was really enjoyable to hunt. But we ended up cutting those 80 acres of pines and sold them for pulpwood. And after we cut them, we decided to work the field up and sow it in grass in order to make pasture out of it. When we sowed it, a drought hit. The grass didn't come up. We neglected that 80 acres. It just kind of grew up into a bramble. It grew up into briars and wild grasses and weeds and lespedeza. And all of a sudden, we had, when I'd never seen quail before, quail showed up. We had identified at least 5 covey of quail on that 80 acres. We had more rabbits than I'd ever seen in my life. We literally could have killed dozens of rabbits every time we went rabbit hunting on this 80 acres. Again, it just exploded. And that was my first experience with, if you get the habitat right, you're going to have the animals. We wonder here, not only in Tennessee, but in the Southeast, where our quail population has gone. We have great stories to tell about how we restored turkey and the white-tailed deer, not only in Tennessee, but all over the South. And it's been successful. It's been great for the hunters. But why have the quail disappeared? My personal experience of what I've witnessed on my own farm, it's about habitat. It's about getting the right kind of habitat. We didn't stalk the quail. They just showed up. And it shocked me. We knew we had a few rabbits around. Of course, found out that rabbits and quail like the same type of habitat, but they just showed up. So to get into what happened, TWRA, I think, had a very sound plan, and they're doing this in other parts of the state, but to take a small portion of the Bridgestone Firestone Wildlife Management Area, that management area is about 10 or 12,000 acres in size, but take a small portion of that, just a few hundred acres, and create what's called an oak savanna. And an oak savanna is a type of habitat we had here in Tennessee on the Cumberland Plateau prior to Europeans coming and manipulating the environment and manipulating the growing trees for profit. Nothing wrong with growing trees for profit. That's what I did when I was cutting my trees back home. But still, we changed that, and when we change that environment, when we change the type of vegetation that you have, you change what animals can live there and thrive there. And that's why the quail are disappearing, I believe. And TWA was going to create this savanna to help quail and other wildlife, even white-tailed deer, we all know, are much more edge animals than they are big forest animals, even though I enjoy hunting a big forest. I enjoy hunting, going into the hardwood forests of the Cherokee National Forest, that's where I bear hunt. It's enjoyable to go in and to see the big trees. But if we really want to help wildlife, especially targeted wildlife like quail, we're going to have to create the environment for them to come. So TWRA had this plan to take a few hundred acres, create habitat for quail. Well, opposition started. I think the opposition probably started locally with a few people who were used to hunting the big woods, liked hunting the big woods like most of us do, and had used the same area for a long time. But it snowballed. It snowballed like something I'd never seen. When the opposition started, it not only contained and gathered in groups like local hunters and hikers, but also environmental groups like the Sierra Club. which that one shocked me. I know some people in Nashville who are members of the Sierra Club, and I tried to have a rational conversation with them. I said, aren't you for our forest and our lands being as natural as possible, being as close to untainted by man as possible? Why would you not be for a type of restoring a type of environment that we had here prior to men coming and manipulating the forest and manipulating what kind of trees grow or what kind of habitat formed? And it was just, to me, it was very, very odd to see this coalition again of local hunters, hiking groups, local government officials, and then the more environmental groups, those groups that we generally consider enemies in the world of conservation, excuse me, and protecting the rights of the citizens of our states to hunt and fish. And so you had this strange coalition come together. They had some very sympathetic ears and people in the media who stoked the opposition to this management plan by TWRA. And of course, then the legislators got involved, especially those that lived in that area. And I don't blame the legislators. Those are the people that vote for them. And it's pretty tough. I can tell you from experience, being in the legislature for 16 years, it's pretty tough when a loud, vocal group of citizens come to you and ask you to do something. And so I don't blame them. They were just responding to their constituents. But it created an atmosphere where it made it virtually impossible for TWRA to go forward, and they could not go forward with this management plan. Now, I've had conversations with TWRA since, and I think when they try anything like this in the future, they are going to start out much differently. They are going to go in first and educate local government officials, the state legislators in whether it would be Bridgestone or the Cherokee National Forest in my part of the state, if they were going to make some land improvements and improvements for our wildlife in those areas, they're going to come in first and educate local government officials, reach out to local civic groups, anybody else they can get to get in front of it. It was what happened on the Bridgestone area with this oak savanna habitat they wanted to create. Once they got behind the story, once the other side was able to get out and just start talking about how they're going to cut all these old growth trees, we've been enjoying these trees since we were kids, and once they got behind that story, they could never catch up. So I think going forward, you're going to see our wildlife management agency, and I would encourage, if you're watching or listening today in another state, if your wildlife agency is proposing to make some major changes around habitat in any of their areas, they need to get out in front of the story. They need to get out in front with local government officials, local groups, and educate them on the front end about why they're doing something, not just to improve hunting, but hey, we're restoring a habitat that was historically here for thousands of years in Tennessee. And it would be here if it was not for civilization changing the environment. And get out in front of that to start with. And I think they're going to be much more successful. I think you'll see our wildlife agency, TWRA, do that going forward, whether it's on Bridgestone or whether it's on any of our other public lands. But yes, you already mentioned the bills that were filed that were absolutely ridiculous. Going back to the misinformation that was put out by the other side. They said this was all about money. They just want to cut the trees because they get to keep the money. Well, the trees would have been worth about $80,000 to TWRA. That's a drop in the bucket in their budget. That's not why they were wanting to do this, but that's what the other side did in getting their side of the story out first, that made it virtually impossible for TWRA to go forward with this plan. I don't know if they ever do go forward with it in Bridgestone at this same location. If they do, it'll be a long time. But I do know that going forward, when TWRA makes proposals to change habitat for the better, to make the habitat better either for quail, turkey, or whatever type of animals we're talking about. You're going to see them start differently on the front end, educating local government officials and the state legislators from that area. So we get to tell our side first before the enemies of conservation are able to tell their side and get out with the story. The old saying about a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth can put its pants on. That's what happened in this situation.
Thank you, Senator Bell. Yeah, it's I think you hit all the highlights there, and definitely concerning when you have your local hunters and Sierra Club teaming up, and yeah, front end education goes a long way. So thank you for providing that perspective.
Absolutely.
From a state legislator. So
okay.
Now I'd like to turn it over to two other folks from Tennessee, Mike Butler and Kevin Botts. Mike is the CEO of the Tennessee Wildlife Federation, and Kevin is the director of policy for the Tennessee Wildlife Federation. Both of them are very familiar and with the project on the Bridgestone Firestone, and they're going to talk about another project that was proposed subsequent to that on the Catoosa WMA, where it had a different outcome because of Mike and Kevin's leadership. I'll turn it over to you two right now. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
John, good to be with you. I want to start off by kind of connecting some dots, and really my little segment here can be thought of as the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, for those of y'all that know who Paul Harvey was. The other thought that comes to mind is, how many of y'all are Cool Hand Luke fans? Because the thing that screams in my head is, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And building on what Senator Bell just talked about, we hold the conservation easement for that property where that proposed project was put together. And after that whole thing fell apart, what we saw was, one, the need for better communication. Senator Bell was right. The agency lost the narrative around it. In fact, it really never got off the ground. And the take home from that is, we typically do a poor job in the natural resource community, conservation community, and the hunting and fishing community communicating. And we need to be doubling down on investments along those lines around communications. Now, the other thing that comes into play is that times change. Demographics in Tennessee are changing. One of the lead legislative forces fighting against this was a Nashville senator who was wanting to play ball in a yard that was half the state away, and really got involved deeply into the issue and brought a lot of resources and pressure from the urban center of Nashville to insert it into that local rural community, which also had legislative concerns and support that you heard Senator Bell mention. The story behind this and what I'm about to tell you is how you beat these folks. How do you win these fights? And it is around those core pieces of communications and relationships. When we saw what happened, and it was our job to vet what the Wildlife Agency had proposed to be done on that property under the conservation easement, and we signed off on that, and then it fell apart. What happened is the leader of that resistance in White County, Tennessee, eventually hooked up with a county commissioner a couple of counties to the east, Cumberland County, Tennessee, where we have an 83,000 acre wildlife management area called Catoosa. Some of y'all may be familiar with it. It's got about 29,000 of those acres are under active forest management, and 5,000 acres of those have been restored to a savanna grassland as storm damage went in and took over, and beetle damage took over parts. That was converted by the agency. And what the chief antagonist from White County brought to the county commissioner in Cumberland County was, if you want me to show you how to stop forest management on Catoosa, I will show you how we did it on Bridgestone. And so all of a sudden, we're facing a public meeting being called by a county commissioner, bringing in this person from the other county and saying, look, here's the problem. We need to stop forest management on Catoosa. which one of the reasons Catoosa is so amazing is because it's been under active forest management for so long by the Wildlife Agency. It's got great habitat, great hunting, great experience. When we saw that happening, we knew we had to draw a line in the sand. And so we reached out to John and others, and Mark and other organizations, and we formed something that we now call the Tennessee Grasslands Coalition, because grasslands and the restoration of grasslands, as is probably the case where you are, is a growing topic of interest among conservationists. And we have two very important grassland restoration functions here in Tennessee. We have the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative at Austin Peay University, and we have the Center for Native Grass Studies at the University of Tennessee. And so it's a big thing here in Tennessee. It's a growing thing in the South. The long and short of it is that we put together this coalition. We had several preparation meetings, and we made sure that we turned out in numbers at the public meeting. And at that public meeting, I've only been to a couple of public meetings that were as one-sided as this one was. So you had the opposition speaker come in, and the county commissioner was standing at front, and he let that guy go first, talking about what they had done, how they had saved the Bridgestone Centennial Wilderness, and how they'd stopped this terrible forest management. And here's what you need to do to stop it in your community, and really running everybody down the road. That was followed by a panel of biologists and experts, field experts from the agency, who explained, well, here's what the management plan is around this property. Then the floor opened for public comment, and this is when it got real fun. The first speaker walks up to the podium, and he has a backpack, and he sets it down, and he reaches in and he pulls out a skull with these little spiked 3-inch antlers, and he goes, I've been hunting Catoosa Wildlife Management Area for 30 years, and this is the first deer I killed on this place in 1980, whatever. And then he pulls out a picture from his backpack, big 810 by glossy, of a nice big 12-point whitetail. And he goes, this is the deer I harvested last year at Catoosa Wildlife Management Area. The Wildlife Agency is doing a great job, and you don't need to listen to a word this guy said coming from White County. He needs to go home. And for the next hour, speaker after speaker after speaker got up from the coalition and even from friends of our coalition members and literally spoke truth to light about the importance of active forest management, the impact it was having, and the fact that they wanted this guy to go away. You even had people from his home county come all the way over to Cumberland County to make the statement that, hey, he screwed up our county. Don't let him do it to your county. And here's the take-home message. That meeting was really important because that's the home district of our Speaker of the House. And I can't imagine what we would be talking about had it gone the way Bridgestone went, but it didn't. And so everybody's familiar with building coalitions. We all do it in our work in different times for different reasons. But I can't emphasize enough that bringing professional communications capacity and that grassroots capability together really is a winning formula for making sure that not only do you win those public meetings, but you got to sustain it to win the public policy debate. Because this is not about facts as much as we know the facts. It's about emotion. And those communications professionals are the ones that know how to weave that in to help our side tell our narrative that brings people to the table to help us fight these fights and win. So with that, does that cover what you wanted, John?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So just want to draw the contrast there. The Bridgestone was effectively stopped, and then y'all got ahead of the Catoosa one, and that video is online on YouTube if anyone wants to watch it. It's fantastic. And yeah, that project's able to go forward, and that proactive communication and getting everybody together is what really said the message for today.
And here's the thing, right now, I'll close with this. You know, that Grasslands Coalition has met a couple times since on Zoom calls. And the next order of business is that we're putting together, that you'll see pretty soon, a letter that affirmatively asks our wildlife agency to engage in grassland restoration where possible and where it makes sense on their properties proactively. And that sounds kind of silly. Well, why, if they're already doing it, why do you need to ask them to do it? Here's why you need to ask. Don't put your wildlife agencies in the position of leading with their chin. If it is an idea brought by constituents to them, then when people come up and oppose those ideas, they have in writing support from the community saying, we want you to do this. That's very, very important. So often I see wildlife agencies come up with great ideas and then be the ones to initiate those ideas, and they get beat up over. We're able to work with our agency to say, look, we want you to do this. We know you want to do it. We know the science is sound. Let us be the ones making the formal request so that when somebody comes out and tries to beat up on you, they got to come beat up on us.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's really good. Yeah, I think there's some, we talked about before, some learning lessons as far as the communication stuff you talked about, and, breaking down language that's going to be digestible for the general public, avoiding silvicultural forest management terms like square feet of basal area, and, talk about habitat and what cover and food and what wildlife needs, because conversely, we saw what that lady in the paper did. She did the opposite, which used terms that are incorrect, like deforestation and clear cutting and all those sort of things, which are very emotional. So anyway, thank you for all you did, Mike. Thanks for your comments here. Kevin, we appreciate all y'all's work in Tennessee. We're gonna have questions at the end, so we'll come back to you. But at this time, we're gonna turn it over to Charles Ferris. Mark, you want to jump in here? Or you want me to provide the introduction?
Sure, John, I'll jump in. And thanks, Mike and Kevin, for that input. It's now my pleasure to introduce Charles Ferris. Charles is the Southern Appalachian Forest Conservation Coordinator for the Ruffed Grouse Society and the American Woodcock Society. He's also based out of North Carolina. Charles has extensive experience working with private landowners and government land managers who are interested in improving their land for ruffed grouse, American woodcock, and other wildlife. Charles, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here and honored to be with all of you all, Senator Bell, Mike, and Kevin. Really just want to echo what everyone said so far today, because I think we're all in agreement with it. And there's a lot of factors that come into play with communicating with the public and, communication, especially about the science, because the science is there. And so that's a lot of what I do with private landowners in my previous role with RGS, connecting them to available science when they're oftentimes reluctant to forest management, but they slowly come around because it is there. Folks that you may not think are open to forest management can actually come to see the good in it if you provide them with research and scholarly articles and all those peer-reviewed literature that's very abundant and very very common out there to use as a way to justify this need for young forest habitat and forest management. So I do want to share my screen just briefly. It's not a presentation, but an image, if that's all right, y'all. I think it will help sort of set the stage for this brief discussion on national forests. So I'm going to do that. Is that a possibility, John? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, you want to?
Thank you.
Sure, right now.
Great, thank you. All right, so you should see, everybody see this kind of distribution right here of age classes on national forest. You see that, John? Or great. So just really quick, because I think this is important when we're talking about national forests. This is data collected from the U.S. Forest Service's forest inventory and analysis data. It's essentially a massive data set that the Forest Service collects across the entire U.S. There's a plot for every 15,000 acres where they collect data and they measure trees, and they're able to extrapolate that across the landscape. It's pretty accurate. It also covers private lands too, but this is data from our national forests in the southeastern United States. And so on the y-axis is percent cover, and on the x-axis is age class distribution. So you look at this, it's not too encouraging. So we got a lot in the middle, right? We have a lot of even age forest, roughly 80 to 120 years old, but not a lot of bookends, not a lot of young forest, not a lot of old growth forest either. That term is a little complicated, which I'll maybe dive into later. But the big concern here is the lack of young forests. 0 to 10 years old, 11 to 20 years old, these kind of really valuable cover for grouse, woodcock, quail, all these young forest obligates, pollinators that rely on it. And so now that y'all kind of have a picture of that and recognize there's this glut of even age, homogeneous, kind of boring, single-aged forest on the landscape, I think that's a good jumping off point to talk about the need for management on public land. Because essentially what we're looking at now with our national forest are pretty much a science experiment. We came in and settled the US, however long ago, and industrialization slowly made its way around the eastern US, harvesting a lot of great, wood products were produced. But the problem is it kind of happened overnight because we had such an abundance of resource. And so we pretty much cleared our forest overnight. And now we have this very unnatural glut that has come back and kind of come back all at the same time. Pretty boring, pretty bad for wildlife, which is why we're seeing the declines in these species. And so where RGS really comes into play, we have this whole all lands approach. We're interested in working with private lands for sure. We have a lot of foresters doing that, but we're also interested in working with public lands. And the way we do that is by engaging with stakeholders through partnerships and trying to identify some way to come to agreement on timber harvesting and arguing and justifying the need for management. For example, Nick B. Miller, my supervisor, is currently in a 3-day-long forest plan objection hearing with the Forest Service and all of these partners, and really giving a voice for young forest and for forest management for grouse and other wildlife. But in other ways that RGS is helping to do that on public land, on national forest, is the Forest Service has a lot of management to do, and they oftentimes, just get overwhelmed with the NEPA process, with engaging with stakeholders, with all of these different, federal loopholes you have to jump through. So how we're helping them do that is through stewardship agreements, helping them set up timber sales and to advertise those timber sales, to just take the weight off of them so they can go set up other timber sales, so they can go set up other non-native invasive species treatments, so they can get fire on the ground. Any sort of help that we can provide for them is a benefit for them to do more work. In other ways, there's funding available to do pre-commercial treatments, to help do common stand exams, all these things that are a part of helping this forest function and updating the plan and helping the forest implement future timber sales, helping them in that process to apply for that funding, develop agreements, and implement it. In other ways, we a couple times in the past, really many times in the past year, we've developed landowner tours and public tours of treatments on national forest with phenomenal scientists and researchers with the forest, such as Dr. Tara Kaiser, the director of the Center for Hardwood Restoration, Dr. Katie Greenberg, a research ecologist at Bent Creek Experimental Forest. Two great researchers that really know the ins and outs of silviculture, of forest management, of this disturbance-dependent wildlife. They have published countless studies under peer-reviewed journals, with some of the top academics in the country, if not the world, justifying the need for this young forest, for the addressing issues like the loss of our upland oak hickory forest to beech and maple, which is a product of fire suppression. All of these things that the public just doesn't quite, can't grasp, and I can't really blame them for it. They're probably, I'm especially a nerd, I kind of get pretty happy when I open up the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management and start reading about, how to better manage an oak forest. But I'm kind of a weirdo in that sense, I guess. But, taking that complicated research and data and synthesizing it and providing it to the public to understand, like, hey, this is not such a bad thing. And really, it's not that abnormal. It's pretty natural when you think about it. If humans have been on this continent for 10,000 years, back when the last ice age was ending, and this was all a boreal forest similar to Canada, our current forest assemblages, the species assemblages, have only been around for about 4,000 to 5,000 years. And we know fire came right up around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, if not a little earlier. So these forests evolved hand in hand with humans managing them, with fire, with practicing sort of smaller scale agriculture. We lost major disturbing wildlife species like bison, elk, beaver. Just this landscape has entirely changed kind of overnight, and communicating that to the public to get them on board with silviculture and forest management on public land is really where RGS is really trying to hone in on, and we're working on some ideas of some publications and some more sort of peer-reviewed literature on addressing that as well. So yeah, so I think in some, it's kind of a big topic, but providing those resources for the Forest Service. And then also, working, TWRA is a phenomenal partner. We have a great partnership with them over in with a dynamic forest restoration block, this sort of massive landscape scale restoration project. We're getting funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, trying to access those funds with them and implement these sort of large landscape scale projects. And I think after all of that kind of talking, I think in some, support TWRA, support their management, get behind them, also engage with public lands as well. And I'm lucky to be surrounded by a lot of national forest, and getting involved with stakeholder meetings and public engagement is super important. So if you're a hunter or an angler, go to your local meetings, join a local chapter of RGS or NWTF, Quail Forever, so many ways to engage. I think I'm probably out of time if I talk too much.
No, thank you so much. That's really good, Charles. And yeah, we really appreciate all the work you all do. I want to give a special shout out to your colleague, Nick, who's been really carrying the weight for the wildlife community and these Nantahala-Pisgah objection meetings. David was involved with them. I was involved with the last couple of days, but we're going to transition from your talk to David Whitmire. And so David can kind of talk to this, but the level of involvement it's very high level. It's very professional. But you also still need that grassroots, that public involvement. So it's a good mix, and we really appreciate everything y'all been doing to fight the good fight there in North Carolina. So
thank you. See y'all.
Yeah, so right now I'm going to turn over to David Whitmire. David is a local sportsman who is in charge of the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Council in North Carolina. David's also really involved with the North Carolina Bow Hunters Association and a number of other sportsmen's groups. And David's family's been in Western North Carolina for generations. And, the Nantahala-Pisgah National Forest is, 1 million acres in Western North Carolina, less than 1% released to successional habitat. So we've seen declines in hunting, declines in wildlife. And when the forest plan revision, basically the land management plan, was started in 2012, and here it is 10 years later today, still going on. It's still not going to be resolved for a while. So David can provide a lot of background on School of Forestry, Gifford Pinchot, Carl Schenck, the Pisgah Game Reserve, and how ironic it is that, now that I think that buck harvest I told Kevin the other day is less than one antler buck per 1,000 acres. Is that right, David? Something like that. So anyway, turn over to David Whitmire. Thanks for all you've been doing, and just to provide your perspective and the importance of sportsmen and being involved in the land management planning process.
Appreciate that, John. Yeah, I'm blessed to live in the cradle of, not only the cradle of forestry, but really the birthplace of conservation. Literally, conservation gods had their fingers all over these forests. Gifford Pinchot, the first forester. Schenck was the first forestry school in America right here in our back door. But what a lot of people don't understand is this is the first place of the Recovery Act for white-tailed deer. And we know what an important conservation success that white-tailed deer has become. It has funded so much other conservation, and it began right in Pisgah, a year after the Forest Service acquired this property of Vanderbilt's, which is one of the first, it is the first national forest east of the Mississippi. 1917, it became the first game preserve east of the Mississippi. And it was that herd of deer that this game preserve was surrounded around, even though grouse and other species flourished because of, we didn't allow hunting in this 80,000 acre or so game preserve. It allowed them to stalk deer in many other states of this nation from 1917 all the way up into the 1940s. We stalked deer in Alabama and Mississippi. The first whitetail study in the nation was the Frederick Russ whitetail deer study in the late 20s. Leopold was asked to come to the seminar that brought this study on. So just the history here is just phenomenal. And I love living here. I had enjoyed growing up in the hunting community. My great uncles, my grandfather, my father, I grew up in just a hunting culture and enjoyed seeing the deer and in seeing successful hunting. We noticed back in the early 90s and throughout the 90s a huge decline in our deer populations. It was troubling. Continue that on for another 20 years in the early 2000s to even up in 2010. Why is this happening? And of course, forestry and the lack of the forest managing, getting young forests back in there was the key. And I kept seeing these projects, these just example that other guests have spoken before, these projects getting killed by these groups. Speaking of the bad things was coming, when we saw this was positive things. And the more I found myself getting involved in asking the district rangers, hey, call me if you need another voice in the newspapers. It opened so many doors for me. And it just kind of happened that the 2012 planning, which was the first collaborative, one of the first collaborative plans in any of our national forests, was happening on the Pisgah-Nantahala. And this allowed those doors open, allowed me to get involved. And I can be with quite success tell you that the sportsmen dominated these early meetings. We got ahead of the game. We knew, we were told it was going to be a 3-year process. We formed the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Council off of the council who had really done just small projects in some of the Pisgah, but we got together across all the districts, 6 districts that's in Pisgah-Nantahala, and we became a voice. And that was heard loud and clear, and we've been participating ever since. A lot of the success we've seen is when we would hit a roadblock, we would open that door. We were told that we could no longer, Forest Service had no capacity, no reason to stay in the game. Even if you get what you want, they can't do it. So we brought their state people together. We've used the state North Carolina Wildlife Commission as our technical advisor. We use the Rough Grouse Society as our technical advisors. But we brought those people in. We got a good neighbor authority passed where we could use other resources. We started looking at other nonprofits that we could partner with. We're not a nonprofit, we're a grassroots, but how to get funding for these. These are all successes. We went to the legislation. We've got extra people to join with the commission and the U.S. Forest Service to be foresters to try to move things on. There's been a lot of success, but 10, 11 years, we're still seeing pushback, and we're still seeing people who have literally made a 3-year process into a 12-year process. It's sad, John. The resources that I've seen spent on this plan could have put a lot of conservation on the ground. I can't expand on the importance is for our local hunters and fishermen to get together, quit bickering amongst yourselves about this and that, and stand together. And because if we ain't got habitat, folks, we ain't got nothing. So I can't stand more to express that. We got to stay together. We got to back these resource managers, folks. We got to stand beside them because they get put on it's amazing the people that do not trust these agencies. And I know of not one species, plant or animal, that has went extinct on these forests in 100 years because of active management. You see all the reasons why not to do anything, but nobody can tell you and put a finger on those. So cheers to you for bringing this forward. I hope if we can be a learning lesson. We didn't have the blueprint. I'd love to heard some of the things I heard at this meeting 10 years ago, but we kind of fumbled our way through this, and I think we've made an impact. But we can't walk away. We got to follow it to the end. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks, David. And it definitely takes a big coalition of folks working together, because like you said, it started out, it was supposed to be a 3-year process, and 10 years later, they're still trying to do the management plan. And, if we're not involved in the management plan, if you think about, an acreage in a pie graph, part's going to be wilderness, part's wilderness study area, Appalachian Trail Corridor, ecological interest area, the special designations goes on and on and on. So really the sliver of land management that you can conduct work is already pretty small. So even if we pass expanded authorities through federal legislation, if the suitable timber base is already so small through the management process, land management process, you're already kind of shot in the foot. So it's really good to have the local voice, yours, and then have the forestry experts like Nick B. Miller. Because right now the meeting's been going on. I was in it this morning, so are you. there's 4 attorneys from one organization there, another attorney from another one, and then about 6 or 7 other environmental groups, and they're just constantly, whether it's soil and water, natural heritage areas, like on and on, climate, every reason under a sun to oppose management, despite all the good work for habitat diversity and the need to support young forest wildlife. So I think timber management is kind of similar, or forest management is kind of similar to hunting. The perception of the public, there's probably a lot of the big chunk that's supportive of it for the right way, and there's probably a small portion that you're never gonna convince them otherwise, and that's what we're dealing with in North Carolina right now. So thanks for all the work you've been doing and your leadership there.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, now I'd like to turn it over to some questions. If anybody, we've got a number of questions in the queue here. Senator Bell, we'll send one to you first. If you're still on the line.
I think we lost Senator Bell.
Okay. Maybe I'll kick this over to the Wildlife Federation folks, Mike and Kevin. It was to Senator Bell, but it's kind of as a lawmaker, what messaging did you think was effective when you're trying to convey the importance of habitat work by the TWRA to legislators when they're already getting that public pushback with misinformation? What was effective messaging for them?
I'll start, and then Kevin chime in here.
Sure.
Based on, I'm going to share one piece. The opposition in this case put a dear colleague letter together. It was a weird marriage of a Republican House member from White County and a Democratic senator from Nashville. And the Democratic senator from Nashville and this Republican member from White County filed the legislation you referred to earlier, John. And the letter they put together was a really misinformed, erroneous document. But because it like in many things in politics, people signed on to it as a favor to a friend. And before we knew it, it had 20 plus signatories on it. But as we started to work with members individually, one-on-one, asking them if they understood what they had signed, it became clear they didn't. And about half of those indicated that they had been duped, is I think the right word. Would you add anything to that, Kevin?
No, I think that's it. Once the letter, the dear colleague letter, got out there, we did start working with the individuals. We started filling in the holes and the gaps, the parts of the story that weren't told. And when they saw the whole story and they looked at the cast of characters, they started pulling their names back off of that.
Yeah. So, going in, sitting down, the relationship side of what groups like CSF and we do, at the General Assembly are critical. I would say this, I'd close with this, John. The other thing that has to happen is we can't do this just when we have these crises. We need sustained efforts that are building relationships and talking about that policy and explaining the science behind it in advance, just to be proactive. And it's really hard because we're all fighting fires on a day-to-day basis. But that proactive, consistent, repetitive mantra of conservation and conservation values is what wins the day.
Agreed.
Yeah, thank you all. That was really good. So this is kind of be a question for the group, and Charles, you want to jump into, or David? Mike, you touched on it, kind of the importance of coalition building, and then David, I'll applaud David when the forest plan revision started for the National Pisgah. He hit the nail on the head. He said we got to hammer home the word wildlife, and not talk about timber harvesting in the negative ways. Talk about supporting and wanting to support wildlife, and that carried the day for a long time, and that was really important. And so kind of pivot into David or Charles. How have you seen through coalition building or otherwise, what can we do to convey to the greater hunting community, as well as lawmakers in some cases, the importance of, that disturbance is critical for healthy ecosystems, and maybe not viewing everything through the lens of a human aesthetics, but looking at it from the ground level from wildlife, because we all know what happens in the paper is, Forest Service proposes, or GWA proposes the cut. The headline in the paper is, this is quote, true industrial scale logging. That was one in the Citizen Times. And the photo is the slash pile from the harvest in December when there's nothing growing. The media is not showing that regenerated young forest 2 years later that's vibrant and has buds and blackberries and food and cover. So this kind of turned to David or Charles on importance of messaging and coalition building and what could be effective.
Thanks, John. I'll start with this, and Charles Charles will finish. We have asked and I've done a lot of it on our local community, because all conservation is local. You've got to build your support. We regularly put articles in the paper about things and keep that going throughout. So we all of a sudden are not just out fighting fires, and people only see us when they're things, but the people know that that the work we're doing is important, and there's more than one side of the story there. That is so important. Going to your legislators before they're and asking them, not going to ask them to rally against something, but to be for something. We're for this. We're not trying to tell you this is and we've tried our best to reach out and be collaborative through this whole process. We're not against old growth forest. We're not against wilderness areas, but at the same time, give us some love back on our matrix areas, or areas where this work can happen. Quit fighting us on that. So we've tried to reach out to the opposition and reach across the aisle and say, hey, we support that, but it's never enough. And unfortunately, we don't control the mass media right in our area here, is because, to be honest with you, Asheville is a cottage industry of folks that do not, their whole goal is to stop active management. And a lot of time this is funded through major donors. I mean, more money than you would ever dream of. So it's that they've got the resources there to change the narrative. So you've got to go into your local areas and build that coalition from the bottom up. You're not going to do it from the top down.
Yeah, really good stuff. Thanks, David. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, I fully agree with David. And I think a couple things that come to mind for me, we've been hosting these webinars, getting up to 600, 700 people attending with, great researchers that are proponents of disturbance dependent wildlife and the science of, disturbance, forest disturbance ecology. So any sort of educational events, I think ideally in person, I think you can kind of connect more with the person in that sense, but webinars are good too. And getting those voices that are doing that research at the forefront, I think is really important. So in the same way that David was talking about scheduling tours of management, it's baffling to me to think that people don't grasp the concept of a clear cut regenerating to a new forest and a hardwood stand. I mean, that's all these forests and hills were eventually clear cut at one point in the past, and they've all come back, and that's what they're recreating in now and walking in and enjoying. So I think, education in some form or not, and getting voices that are actually doing the research and doing the science and getting them kind of engaging with those people. Another thing that comes to mind that I think is sort of the missing piece here, and I know we need to be promoting wildlife as a justification because it's not as much of a political word. It doesn't really rub people the wrong way, but people do use wood products. And I don't really understand what the disconnect is with that. I mean, I can't tell you how many calls I'm on or how many houses I'm in where someone calls logging a sad thing, or they're against it, and yet they have wood all over their house. They all love their red oak table. They all love their bourbon made out of white oak only. I mean, it's just, we like it or not, we use wood. And they talk about pollution being an issue and CO2 emission. Well, the alternatives to wood are way worse for the environment in terms of what they're putting out in terms of pollution or what plastics. I mean, wood is such a great renewable resource that we can manage for indefinitely. And I think connecting people to their woodshed is a great way to start thinking about and maybe marketing about that. Forest Proud does great work associated with the Society of American Foresters. So, connecting them to the fact that we do use this product and we actually can manage it very well, and at the same time provide optimal wildlife habitat. So in some way, I think branding and marketing for the wood products industry would be great. I'd love to see people start using more high quality wood products, wood tables, chairs, because everyone loves hardwood floor. I mean, there was that brief spell of carpet in the 70s that we all regret, but I think we all want to see the carpet get pulled up and the wood come back and the wood keep going down on our floors. So I think so. Education in any way you can do it, and if you're a hunter, know it too. Engage with the science, with the research, with whoever it is that is a professional that you're working with, and then wood products, telling the story of where that comes from, so but that's what I have to share.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. It's really good. I think there's a lot of crossover with the forest products industry and all that sector, and obviously their work goes hand in hand with wildlife habitat work. So whether it's Project Learning Tree or some of the stuff the hunting community does, definitely a lot of overlap. And we're running out of time here. We did get one question from Kara regarding kind of just with the group she works with and apathy among members and trying to encourage their folks to show up versus some of the opposition that maybe paid staff. And I think that kind of goes to what David was talking about, in the plan revision where he's involved. All those folks are there getting paid right now, and they have been for 10 years, and that's why they have the time and the resources and to do that. So, it's, I guess our advice or my advice would be to show people the impacts on the ground and try to expand your networks and leverage the resources you can, whether that's volunteers or professionals or chapters like RGS chapter or NWTF chapter or National Deer Association or other habitat groups. And of course, feel free to reach out to CSF. We're always happy to work individually as an organization. We're also very happy to work where we can with our state sportsmen's legislative sportsmen's caucuses like Senator Bell. So, and that's going to wrap it up for today. Really appreciate everybody joining. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. This is our last webinar for the summer. So if anybody joined other ones, we really appreciate your support. I want to put a plug in for our annual conference for state legislators. There's a link down here in the chat. The NAS Summit's in Bozeman, Montana this year, November 29th to December 2nd. It's going to be a great few days of policy discussions and some outdoor fishing and hunting experiences. So we encourage everybody on here to consider attending. I know a lot of folks on the call and some of our panelists will be there. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on Forest Management or NAS Summit or anything else sportsman related. So thank you all for your time today, and appreciate your support, and please reach out if you need anything.